Okay, so what we looked at in 3.1 were what we call simple statements. It was a sentence with one thought really to it. And we also looked at quantified statements, which means they talked about some kind of quantity, all, some, or none. And then we talked about the negations of those types of statements. So in 3.2, we're going to now build on that and talk about compound statements. So simple statements can be connected with the words and, either or, if then, or if and only if. And so these more complicated statements are called compound. So we're going to go through each one of these connectors. We had Miami as a city in Florida as an example last time. And Atlanta is a city in Florida. So Miami is a city in Florida, so that's true. But the second statement is false. I can put these two statements together. See, these are called simple statements. You see none of those connectors in there. You don't see the words and, if, or, anything like that. So now if I put those connectors in there, either Miami is a city in Florida or Atlanta is a city in Florida, this is now a compound statement that is true. So notice that I just used the connector either or to put those two statements together. Now, it would be acceptable if I did not use the word either and just said Miami is a city in Florida or Atlanta is a city in Florida. So that would be okay. So you could use either or just the word or, and it's the same statement. There are many other ways to say the word or, though. That's going to be much of the equivalence there. Okay, here's another compound statement. Miami is a city in Florida and Atlanta is a city in Florida. So now when I change the connector, I have now made this a false statement. Okay, so let's take a look at each one of these connectors in more detail. If you're using the connector and, then symbolically you use this, this symbol that looks like an upside-down V. Or, if you will, notice that we can make it look like an A by just putting that little bar across it. But it's not an A, okay? So make sure that your symbol looks like an upside-down V. So let's say, for example, that P stands for Harvard is a college, and Q stands for Disney World is a college. And one of your homework questions might say, write this statement that's written symbolically in words. So you would have to look at these symbols and know how to translate that into English words. Okay, well, P stands for what? Okay, Harvard is a college, and Q stands for Disney World is college, and then this symbol we just learned stands for and. So we're just making an and statement here. Harvard is a college and Disney World is a college. So that's your fill in the blank there. So then your next one would be to translate this symbolically. So go ahead and write that into words. Notice the additional symbol that we learned last time. So if you recall, that symbol stands for the negation of Q. So hopefully you wrote something like Harvard is a college and Disney World is not a college. Okay, on page 112, you have a chart that gives you some of the other ways that you can write the word and. Now, one of the ones that's not in the chart is, for the first one, I could have said, both Harvard and Disney World are colleges. So that's one way I could have rewritten it. Both Harvard and Disney World are colleges. So instead of the word and, you could use but. Harvard is a college, but Disney World is not a college. Notice it still means the same thing as the and statement that we did there. Harvard is a college, yet Disney World is not a college. Okay, Harvard is a college, nevertheless Disney World is not a college. So these words are the same thing as the word and. Now remember I mentioned last time that a lot of your questions are multiple choice questions. That does not necessarily make it easier, because you have to be able to identify when these other words mean the simple word of and. Your multiple choice answer could have one of these other words instead. The next one is the either or. When two statements are represented by P and Q, the compound either or statement is symbolized using the symbol that looks like a V. So you would say P or Q when you see those symbols. So this time, let's say that P stands for the bill receives majority approval, and Q stands for the bill becomes a law. So if I want you to write this into words, okay, that P or Q symbolization into words, then hopefully you get something like this. The bill receives majority approval, or the bill becomes a law. Notice that I did not use the word either this time. You could have put either in the front and it would have been the same thing, or you could drop it. Now there aren't other words that you would use for the word or, like the list that we just got for the word and. You basically can put the either in there or not, and those are going to be your options. Now, the thing about or is that there are two types of or. Usually when you guys talk to somebody, your verbal language, you generally use the exclusive or, which means one or the other but not both. But in math, we use the inclusive or, which means one or the other or both. It would be like saying if you went to, if you went to somebody's house for dinner and they asked you, what would you, what sides would you like to eat? And you say, I like green beans or I like mashed potatoes. Are you generally going to be upset if you end up having both on your plate? No, I mean one or the other. Oh, okay, both would work too. So the or that we're using is called the inclusive or. So let's see, the next one that you have on your handout, I think looks like this. Is that right? Okay, so go ahead and fill that in, putting that into words. So hopefully you wrote something like this. The bill receives majority approval, or the bill does not become a law. Now, one of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at this chapter is that the tense of the sentence doesn't matter. It can be past tense, present tense, or future tense. And we're going to count that as the same answer. So don't worry about, those types of things as you're writing. Okay, the next connector that we're going to look at is the if-then statements. So if you put two statements together using the words if-then, then you're going to symbolize that with the arrow. And you know what? I'm going to step back for a second. Actually, let me jump back. I want to be able to relate the or and the and to what we've already seen in Chapter 2. Okay, that was what I forgot to mention here. So you guys saw the words or and in Chapter 2, and what did they stand for? Okay, union was one of the words. Which one was union? Which word? Or. Okay, so or stood for the word union, and stood for the word intersection, right? If not union, intersection. Okay, so if you look at Chapter 2, you had union and intersection, and the symbols were a U or an upside down U. So then for Chapter 3, union was the same as the word or, and intersection was the same as the word And notice that for or, we use a symbol that looks like a V, and we use a symbol that looks like an upside down V. What do you notice between the symbols from Chapter 2 and Chapter 3? Okay, they open in the same direction, good. Just one's shaped more like a U and the other one's shaped more like a V, right? So notice that there are similarities between these because they mean the same word, but the curved one is for set theory, and the one that's more sharp is for logic. So just so that you can relate the difference there. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and move on to our if-then statements. So for if-then, we're going to use that arrow that goes to the right. The way you would say this is if P, then Q. So P is your, this part, whatever comes first is your if part, and whatever comes second is your then part. That becomes sort of important later as we look at all the different ways that you can write something equivalently. So this time, let's say that P stands for Ed as a poet, and Q stands for Ed as a writer. So if you were going to write these symbols into words using this P and Q, you would start out with the word if, write your P, then your word then, write your Q. So you should have something like this. If Ed is a poet, then Ed is a writer. All right, so for your next example, notice that the letters have been reversed, but the first part is still your if part. Whatever letter comes first is your if part. Whatever letter comes second is your then part. So what do you think that would be written in words? Okay, go ahead. Okay, so if Ed is a writer, then Ed is a poet. Good. Now notice that these two sentences don't necessarily mean the same thing. If Ed is a poet, then Ed is a writer. If Ed is a writer, then Ed is a poet. Doesn't necessarily give the same meaning, right? If Ed is a writer, he's not necessarily a poet. He could be a technical writer, totally not a poet then. Okay? All right, and then the next one, okay, so writing that out in words. Okay, if Ed is not a writer, then Ed is not a poet. Very good. Okay, on page 114 in your book, there is another chart that tells you all of the equivalent ways that you can write an if-then statement. Okay, so notice I've written in my book in pencil, because for me it's more important that I identify where the if part is and where the then part is. You can get really tripped up with P's and Q's because it won't always be the same letters. So the first row in our chart is the traditional way we've already written it, if P, then Q. Okay, so if the first statement, then the second statement. But I could also write it as, let me use the if Ed is a poet, then Ed is a writer example. I could also say Ed is a writer if Ed is a poet. Notice that the if part stays the same. If Ed is a poet, then Ed is a writer. Ed is a writer if Ed is a poet. And you would still write it symbolically with the P coming first, then the Q coming second. So the symbolic way to write it always stays the same, but the way you can write it in words changes many times here. Another way you can say it is with these keywords, is sufficient for. If you see the is sufficient for, then the if part has to come first and the then part has to come second. But you're going to change the verb to being. So being a poet is sufficient for being a writer. In other words, that meets one of the conditions to being a writer, right? It's sufficient for. It meets it. It's good enough. So being a poet is sufficient for being a writer. Now notice that the is necessary for reverses what comes first and last. So if you see the keywords is necessary for, the then part has to come first, and the if part has to come second. So being a writer is necessary for being a poet. In other words, you can't be one without the other. It's necessary for you to be a writer in order to be classified as a poet. So you can also say Ed being a writer is necessary for Ed being a poet, if you want to put Ed back in there. Okay, now the last two are also tricky because notice that the word if is in there, but not only the word if, it's only if. So if you throw in the word only if in there, the then part still comes right after it. Notice in the second column, or in the second row, I should say, whatever came after the if was still the if part. But now, whatever comes after the only if is the then part in both of these rows at the bottom here. So Ed is a poet only if Ed is a writer. Only if Ed is a writer, comma, Ed is a poet. Okay, they're very tricky, and we're going to see some examples later of how you're going to need to be able to identify these key words and translate it back to symbols, where order is very important to learn here. So you do want to review this chart and make sure that you're familiar with which key words reverse the order of the if and then. Okay, and then moving on to the last connector, if and only if. So if you're trying to write a statement with the connectors if and only if, then you're going to use a double arrow. Let's say that P stands for the word is set, and Q stands for the word has 464 meanings. And just to make this a little clearer, I'm going to put quotes around the word set. We're talking about the word set, is what that sentence means. The word is set. The word has 464 meanings. So we're talking about that word, quote, set. So if you were going to use the connector if and only if to write this symbolic part into words, you would say the word is set if and only if the word has 464 meanings. Okay, the word is set if and only if the word has 464 meanings. And then your next one on your handout is like this, right? Okay, so go ahead and translate that into words. That's the negation symbol, Q, the double arrow. Yeah, my handwriting's not too good here. And then another negation of P. Now remember that past, present, or future tense doesn't matter here. I have it in present tense, so the word does not have 464 meanings if and only if the word is not set. But you could also say the word didn't have 464 meanings if and only if the word wasn't set. Okay, taking a look at page 116. There are, again, many ways that you can rewrite an equivalent statement for these. The order of the P and Q does not matter, because notice it's a double arrow, and so you could reverse it and you're still pointing the arrow at the same thing. So for that first statement, I could also say the word has 464 meanings if and only if the word is set. So the order of where you write your P and Q doesn't matter. Now, for purposes of being consistent in the class, you know, you want to try and get in the habit is if P was the first one listed, then use P as the first one there. But again, as far as multiple choice answers, they might flip-flop it on you and it means the same thing. Okay, so taking a look at the other options in the chart. So that's the first two rows. The first row is what we started with, and the second row just shows that you can reverse the P and the Q and it gives you the same meaning.
Is this the chart on the handout?
No, this is the chart in page 116. Okay, so then the thing about an if and only if statement is it's really an if-then statement in both directions. So the next two rows in the chart explain that you could rewrite it as two if-then statements. So it means if P then Q and if Q then P. So going from left to right and going from right to left. So the example they gave you here is P stands for a person is an unmarried male and Q stands for a person is a bachelor. So looking at that third row there, if a person is an unmarried male, then that person is a bachelor, and if the person is a bachelor, then that person is an unmarried male. So we just wrote the whole thing from left to right, put in the word and then reverse the if-then from right to left. That's what an if and only if means, is that both sides have to work, both conditions have to be met for it to be true. Okay, so now notice that in the last two rows, these words should look familiar. You see, is necessary and sufficient for. Notice that we are using both of these words together, is necessary and sufficient for. That's what your tip-off is, that it's an if and only if. If you only see is necessary for, then that's an if-then. If you only see is sufficient for, then that's an if-then. But when you see them both together, it's an if and only if. Okay, being an unmarried male is necessary and sufficient for being a bachelor. Or you can reverse the order. Being a bachelor is necessary and sufficient for being an unmarried male. Because again, the order of your statements does not matter in an if and only if. So any questions there? So let's go through these symbols now. So we've talked about the negation, and that symbol uses that tilde on the keyboard, that squiggly line there. And then each of these connectors has a proper name as well. So the first one is conjunction, and that stands for the word and. If any of you guys are Schoolhouse Rock fans, then I've now put the song in your head, right, by saying that. Okay, the conjunction, junction, what's your function song. I used to date myself when I said that, but now then they brought it back, and so it was okay for me. All right, so disjunction is the word for or. A conditional statement is the word for if-then. And then think about that, conditional. See, in an if-then, a condition must be met for the result to occur. If this happens, then you have this conclusion. Okay, so that's where that comes from, conditional. And so the biconditional stands for the if and only if. So the prefix bi, meaning both, you know, two conditions, meaning that it has to work both ways. If the first thing, then the second thing, and if the second thing, then the first thing. We're talking about compound statements, where most likely there's going to be more than one simple statement. I want to add symbolically up here to the negation, where you might see a negation outside parentheses. Because maybe you've got, you know, an and statement or an or statement in here. but if you see a negation outside parentheses, I want to help you translate that into words. So you know that when it was just in section 3.1, 95% of the time you just put the word not in there, and you created the negation. So that little squiggly symbol translated to the word not. If you see this negation outside parentheses, that translates to it is not true that. And then whatever's inside parentheses follows after that. Yes?
Can we just do it? Will we be able to do that
If it wasn't in parentheses, then it would be more like what you just saw on the examples that you wrote out with the connectors, where only that one simple statement got a negation. Okay, so if it looks like, say it's this statement, you would not use the it is not, well, you could, but you'd have to use it both times. It is not true that this, and it is not true that that. No, it's not the same thing. So you have to be very careful. But most likely, if you saw something like this, then you would say, let's say Harvard is a college, Disney World is not. Disney World is, okay, so you would say Harvard is not a college and Disney World is not a college. Okay, you would most likely just put the word not in there. But when you see parentheses, then it is not true that. Or if you see the words in a sentence, it is not true that, and then you have a compound sentence coming after that, then to put it back to symbols, you want to use that negation in parentheses, and then whatever the compound is that follows fits inside those parentheses. And hopefully we'll see some of those examples here in a second. Okay, so let's take a look at some examples from Math Excel. Okay, so we have statements for P and Q. The taxes are high, the stove is hot. And then it gives you a statement in words. The taxes are high and the stove is hot. And it wants you to translate it into symbolic form. Now, I started out with an easy one here, but I want to get you guys in a habit, before you do any translating, I want you to identify any of these connectors or keywords that are in the statement. Okay, so the taxes are high and the stove is hot. What do you see? And, good. If you can get in the habit of doing that, it's going to really help you to translate these items symbolically. Notice that once I circle the and, it splits it up into the two simple statements. You can see that we're starting with the taxes are high, so what letter is that? P. Okay, right here it's already been identified for you. And then the stove is hot is Q. And so then we just have to figure out which symbol stands for the word and notice that all your symbols are over here to the left. So is it the one that opens down or the one that opens up? Down, good. And, question? The symbol, well, the and statement is called a conjunction. It doesn't, the sign doesn't have, the V, the upside down V doesn't have a special name like the negation symbol does. It's just an upside down V, or the symbol for and. Okay, so I'm going to type in here P and Q. Good job. So then, moving on, let's look at this one. Okay, so you are not short, but I'm tall. So the first thing I want you to do is identify any key words that you see in here. Okay, not. And I like to underline my word not and circle my connectors. So what word here is the connector? But, good. Now that wasn't one of our general ones. What did but stand for? And is correct. Okay, so here's why I was saying you need to really get familiar with what all your other options are for the words so that you can, know which symbols you're supposed to be using here. Okay, and one of the things I didn't comment on that order isn't important as far as your, where your P and Q comes, but again, if we want to stay consistent, let's put it in the order that we see it coming. So you're not short would be what? Okay, the negation of Q, good. So you could say not Q, that's how we'd say it. So not Q, and then we just mentioned that but stands for and then I'm tall is P. Excellent. There's going to be lots of different examples where you need to translate these statements. Let me get to some of the challenging ones. This is not a turtle if it's not a reptile. So this time it's multiple choice. And remember, first you're supposed to identify your keywords. So what do you see? Not. Okay, just if. Yeah. All right, so this is not a turtle if it's not a reptile. Now within, so notice you see the word if. So if this is an if-then statement, then order is very important. And remember that the if part has to come first symbolically, and the then part comes second symbolically. So you have your choices. You have your first choice, second choice, third choice, and fourth choice. So let's see. Again, I'm throwing something tricky at you. Let's see if you can pick the right choice here. I have a majority of 2, I think. Nope. Okay. So let's go through this. Those of you that answered 2, you were at least correct that it's an arrow. Okay, giving only one other option. Okay. And so when you're looking at these keywords, now this was the chart that I mentioned, I think page 114? Yeah. So when you just see the word if, there's not the word only is in there, just if, then whatever comes after the word if is your if part of your statement. The other part then automatically defaults to then. And when you're writing these symbolically, the if part has to be written first. It has to be if from on the left, then on the right. So therefore, this is the part that has to be written first symbolically. So if it's not a reptile means that, okay, reptile is Q, and you have not, forgot to underline that word, not a reptile. So not Q has to come first. Or if you want, you can write your arrow over here. You say, okay, I know it's an if-then, and so I need my arrow. Whatever the if part is has to come first, and the then part has to be written second. So the not a reptile has to come first, leaving the other part to come second, not a turtle, which is not P. So this is how you want to translate symbolically an if-then sentence. If you can identify it's if-then, you have your arrow. Whatever the if part is has to be first, whatever the then part has to be second, but that's the challenge, is to figure out what order it's coming in. Okay, so those of you that said choice 1, good job. Being human is necessary for not having wings. Being human is necessary for not having wings. So what keywords do you see in here? Okay, is necessary for, and the word not. Good. So the first thing you want to ask yourself, what kind of statement does the keywords is necessary for give me? Okay, let's see, what are my answers here? I see a lot of choice 2s, I think I have the most of. Nope, but you're close. Excellent. Okay, so here's the thing. Is necessary for is an if-then statement. So right away I know I have a single arrow. If it had is necessary and sufficient for, then it would have been a double arrow. Okay, but it didn't have both of those, it just had one. So is necessary for is an if-then statement. But then you have to wonder, okay, so which side of the is necessary for is your if and which side is your then? And that's what you're going to ask yourself. So remember that symbolically, if always has to be written first, but that's not necessarily how it comes in the sentence. So is necessary for is one of the ones that reverses the order. The if comes second, the then comes first. So if you can identify that, again, this is why in my book I wrote the words if then, and I wrote all over that chart in my book. If then, it's what's the if part, what's the then part. So the if part comes after is necessary for, so the not having wings is the if part, and you have wings as Q, so I need a not Q to come first as my if part. And therefore the you are human, the P, comes second in the symbolic form. Okay, any questions there? So notice we had two if-then questions, and you're doing the same thing. Circle your connectors. If you identify it's an if-then, you know it's a single arrow, but then you have to figure out which part of your sentence is the if and which part is the then. And you're always going to symbolically put the if part first and the then part second. So the order of, with the arrow, that never changes. It's only when it's in words does it all jumble around. Okay, so the stove is not hot if and only if the play is not boring. So what keywords do you see here? Okay, not. If and only if. And another not. Okay. So then you have choice 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, 4. Excellent. So this one was a little more straightforward because you actually saw the common if and only if. So if and only if means double arrow. The order is not important on this one, but the fact that you had not on both sides means you had to make sure that you had a negation on both of your letters for your simple statements. Okay, my completed homework is necessary and sufficient for me to get a raise. My completed homework is necessary and sufficient for me to get a raise. So what keywords do you see here? Okay, so is necessary and sufficient for. So be careful because you see the word and in there, but and is associated to the necessary and sufficient, so it's all one big keyword. We don't see any nots this time. So you have choice 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay, so the majority have chosen 4. Fantastic. Okay, so necessary and sufficient, both of those words appeared there. So when they're both together, then that's what tells you that it's an if and only if, and you have a double arrow. And then you just have to put your P and Q, in there. But, so they put it in the order that they saw it. My homework completed is Q. For me to get a raise is P. But this would have been the same answer. Okay, because in an if and only if, the order does not matter. Okay, and then they're going to have you go in the opposite direction. And they'll give it to you in symbols, and they want you to translate it into words. So here's what you're translating symbolically. And they've told you that P stands for the play is boring, and Q stands for it is time to sleep. So your choices, the play is boring and it is not time to sleep. The play is not boring and it is time to sleep. The play is not boring and it is not time to sleep. The play is not boring or it is time to sleep. So choice 1, 2, 3, or 4. And I see the majority have chosen 2. Fantastic, good. So the first thing when you're going from symbols to words is, I'm betting that a lot of you guys in your head, you said, oh, okay, that's an and. And then you had to negate the P. The play is not boring. So showing that here you had the right connector for and the keyword not in the correct simple statement. But remember that the choice could have also been, the play is not boring, but it is time to sleep. Because remember that and can also be written with the word but, yet, or nevertheless. So make sure that you're, looking for those keywords as well. All right, one thing that I want to show you in the book, okay, it has this really good example of 2 ways that you could write a sentence that has the same words. And I'm looking on page 119, but I'm going to write it down for you on paper. Example 8. It wants you to write each of these in symbolic form. So I do not fail the course. If and only if I study hard and I pass the final. The other option is, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. Do you notice anything different about those 2 ways that I wrote these 2 sentences? Okay, one has a comma and the other one doesn't. That's the only difference. Do you notice how many connectors you see in there? You see 2 connectors. Right, we haven't seen any sentences yet with 2 connectors. We've only had 1. Okay, so when you have more than 1 connector, then that means that you're probably going to have to use parentheses in there somewhere. And there is a chart, a couple charts, and this is on page 119 as well, that tell you the dominance of the connectors. So if you look at the green part at the top, the least dominant symbol is the negation, and then next would be the conjunction and disjunction. Notice that they go together, and or, they're the same level of dominance. The next one would be the conditional, and the most dominant symbol is that biconditional, the double arrow. And so if you're looking at a statement that's been written symbolically, so here they've given you several examples, and then they showed which one was the most dominant symbol in red. So you have 2 connectors here. You have an arrow and an and. You also have a negation, but that's not a connector. That's just a symbol there. So the one that's most dominant tells you where you're going to split it in half. And if there's more than 1 letter on 1/2, then you put parentheses around it. So for example here, the arrow is more dominant than the and, as listed here. The arrow is more dominant than the and. So it's at the arrow that I'm going to split this in half. So notice that where I've split it in half with my pencil mark there, I have more than one letter on the right. So that tells me that I should put parentheses around those two letters. Now notice here we have an arrow and a double arrow, but according to our chart, here let's look at this one where I've already written on it. According to our chart, the double arrow is more dominant, so I'm going to split it in half right there. Since there are two letters off to the right, I need to put parentheses around those ones off to the right. And notice even down here we have three connectors, but the arrow is the most dominant, so you split it in half right there. And we have more than one letter off to the left, so I put that in parentheses. And we have more than one letter off to the right, so I put that in parentheses as well. And the most dominant symbol tells you what kind of statement it is as far as those proper names are. Notice off to the right it tells you, okay, the first one was conditional, the second one's a conditional, the third one's a biconditional, even though there is an arrow in there. The more dominant one tells you what type of statement that is. Okay, so now let's go back to this example that I showed you, and we're going to start with the first one and just write it out in symbols. So what keywords do you see? Okay, not, if and only if, and, okay, any other keywords? Now notice they didn't tell us what P, Q, and R stood for. And there are going to be times when you're not told what P, Q, and I guess later in the solution they do, but sometimes you will have to figure this out on your own. So you need to label which one's P, which one's Q, and which one's R. Now, if you've already identified the connectors, it helps you, because notice it's separated out the simple statements for you. So P would be the first one. Notice it says I do not fail the course, but whenever we write P, Q, and R, we don't want to use the word not. So P would stand for I fail the course. So then Q would be your next simple statement. So, okay, we took care of this one. Here's our if and only if, and then now that shows us the next one. I study hard. So that's Q. And then we need an R because we have another simple statement. I pass the final. The important thing is when you're identifying your simple statements, you don't use any of the connectors in there. Notice that in the P, Q, and R, I don't have the words and, if, nothing like that is in there. The other thing is that you need a complete sentence. So P stands for I failed the course. It's a complete sentence. Not just fail the course. Okay, I fail the course. Sometimes when you're looking at these sentences, only part of the simple statement is visible in the sentence, and you have to create that complete sentence. Okay, so to translate this symbolically, I know I have an if and only if, so I need a double arrow. Does order matter when I have if and only if? No. Okay, so I don't have to worry about which one's which here. I also have an and. Okay, let's get to that in a second. So what comes before the if and only if? What do I have to write down? Okay, negation of P. So not P. If and only if. And then after that's going to come this statement. The next simple statement is I study hard, so that's Q. Because and, we don't have to worry about the order either, so I'm just going to write it as I see it. And then last would be R. Okay, so which one is the most dominant symbol? The biconditional, the if and only if. So I'm going to split it right here. So notice that that means I need parentheses around this part on the right. Now, we already stated that the only difference between these two sentences was what? A comma. Okay, so I have the same keywords in here. And so symbolically wise, I'm going to rewrite this the same way. But the difference is that comma is going to tell us where the parentheses go. So a comma supersedes everything. If you have a comma, and we had a comma right here before the and, then that tells us that we are splitting it where the comma is. It does not matter what the most dominant connector is. So the comma says I'm splitting it right here, so I'm going to put the parentheses around the left two symbols, left two simple statements. Okay, so that is the biggest difference when you're translating this symbolically. Make sure you're paying attention for commas. And you're only going to have a comma, a parentheses, if you have 3 different letters. If you only have 2 letters, you only have more than one connector. If you only have one connector, well, then you don't need parentheses there, right? It's just, that's what you have. It's already grouped. So when you have more than one connector, you're going to need to figure out where the parentheses go. Okay, so notice that these 2 sentences actually have different feelings when they come to the sentences, a slightly different meaning. I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. So the first way without the comma, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. So I have to study hard and pass the final for me to not fail the course, and vice versa. Okay, so if I haven't failed the course, that means I did both study hard and pass the final. If I did both study hard and pass the final, then I did not fail the course. Now the second sentence, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard, comma, and I pass the final. So in other words, the condition to not fail the course is only studying hard, because that's where the grouping comes in. Right here, the if and only if only includes the Q. So if I did not pass the final, course. If I did not fail the course, then I studied hard, and if I studied hard, then I didn't fail the course. And I happen to pass the final also. So that's the biggest difference when you see commas and you don't see commas. So this is technically an and statement because of where the parentheses are. The comma made that and more dominant in there. All right, so that pretty much, well, let's take a look at one of those in Math Excel that gives you 3 simple statements. Okay, so it tells you what P, Q, and R stand for, and it shows you the sentence, I eat bananas and it is Tuesday, comma, or it is snowing outside. And, or, and the comma. Okay, so the comma is important there. Now, does and or, do you have to worry about the order of how the sentence is written? No. So you can just translate it as you see it from left to right. And so I eat bananas is what letter? P. The and symbol is the one that most looks like an A. It is Tuesday, Q. The or symbol, just flip that over. It is snowing outside, R. Okay, so the comma tells us where to split it. And so since the comma comes right in front of the or, we're going to split it right there. So now that tells us where to put our parentheses. And so we're going to put parentheses around the 2 statements on the left. All right, so I need parentheses, P and Q, close my parentheses, or R, right? Did I write it in with the right letters in the right spot? Nice work. Okay, you also see it in the reverse. Where you have to take what's in symbols and translate it into words. So here's what you're translating. Now, they didn't put parentheses in here, but you could figure that out because you know which symbols are most dominant. Okay? And so you have three choices. If we do not go to the pool or the temperature is not above 80%, then we have not finished studying. If we do not go to the pool, then the temperature is not above 80%, I'm sorry, I said percent both times, didn't I? Degrees, or we have not finished studying. And the third choice is if we do not go to the pool, comma, then the temperature is not above 80 degrees and we have not finished studying. I think I see a majority of 2. Well done. Okay, so we had 2 or 3 is what we saw, what I saw out there, choice 2 or choice 3. So let's take a look at the difference between these two choices. So if you look at the second choice, what connectors do you, or keywords do you see there? Okay, if, then. Okay, so that's really one connector. The not. Okay, not again, or, and then the not again. And then if we look at this one, our connectors are if, we have a keyword of not, then, not, and not. Okay, so what's the difference between these two? The and the or. Okay, so it's a very subtle difference, and so you really have to pay attention to what the symbol was that you had here. And so this was the or symbol, being as why the second choice was correct. Okay. So notice they weren't trying to trick you with how the order of the sentences went or where the comma goes. It was just really, can you see that or and the and in there? Okay, so there's one more symbol that we haven't translated completely. Okay, so here you have and you're trying to translate that into words. And so you have 4 choices there. Can everybody see the choices okay? I think I see a majority of 1. Well done. Okay, so if you recall, some of you did recall that I said if you see this negation outside parentheses, then you're going to start out with, it is not true that. And so you did have a couple choices like that. And then you just follow with exactly what's inside parentheses. And what was inside parentheses was P and Q. I eat bananas and this is an octopus. Don't change anything else to what you see inside of there. So that's what you saw in that first choice. Some of you guys said the second choice, that notice that in the second choice it added an extra not. That's like saying a double negative in your sentence. It is not true that I do not eat bananas and this is not an octopus. But when you see that parentheses, it is not true that, and then exactly what you see in parentheses should follow. Don't change anything. Don't add any more negations to it or anything. Now, you might have a negation in there. You might see something like this, where you have another negation symbol inside parentheses, and that's when you would throw in that word not in there, okay, inside of that. So any questions on something like this? Okay, and then in the very last part of your homework, it gets a little bit bigger, okay, what they're giving you here. So it wants you to write the compound statement in symbolic form. Let letters assigned to the simple statements represent English sentences that are not negated. And if commas do not appear, then use the dominance of connectives to show the grouping symbols or parentheses. Okay, so if I have the time or I like my family, then I do not miss the family reunion. The first thing you should always do when you see this is what? Okay, so find those key words. Good. So get in that habit. It'd be helpful if you wrote this down in your notes and just start practicing circling those keywords. So if I have the time or I like my family, then I do not miss the family reunion. If I have the time or I like my family, then I do not miss the family reunion. Okay, so I want to give you guys a minute to do the circling on your own without my help and seeing if you might see the answers here. Now, if you notice after the sentence, it tells you what P, Q, and R should represent. If you do these problems in the book, it doesn't tell you what P, Q, and R represent. You have to figure that out. All right, let's see how you did. What keywords did you see in there? Okay, if, then, or, not. Anything else? Okay. All right, so you saw if, then, and or. So and the not, right. But I'm saying connector-wise anyway. If, then tells you what kind of symbol? A single arrow. And or tells you opens up. Good. Looks like the V. Okay, so the tricky part, though, is where this is going to go. Notice that in your if part is where that or symbol came. So that's part of the if part of this if-then sentence. And so it told you that I have the time is P, and I like my family is Q. So you had P or Q, and that was your whole if. Then the negation of R. Okay. So if you got that far, you eliminated a lot. Okay? It didn't trick you too much here. But now you have to figure out where the parentheses go. And so what was the most dominant symbol? The what? The arrow. Good. So the more dominant symbol is the arrow, so you're splitting it here. And then that tells you everything on the left is your parentheses. Good. Okay. So what choice is that? 2. Any questions on what we did there? Excellent. Okay, so that concludes section 3.2.